Welcome to the Chapter 7 lecture based on the readings in the textbook Terrorism Today, The Past, the Players, the Future, 5th edition. I'm Professor Perkins. We're in the Crim 108 class and we're going to get started. So our chapter agenda will include the following learning objectives. First, we're going to trace the history of Russian terrorism from the early 20th century to the breakup of the Soviet Union. Then we're going to understand how Russia, as a result of the Chechen crisis, has been subjected to terrorism from Islamists in the Caucasus area. And we're going to describe how the Balkan region became an area for ethnic cleansing. We're also going to be able to appreciate the difficulty in defining terrorism relative to the events in the Balkans and Chechnya. So we're going to start with the first learning objective, and that's to trace the history of Russian terrorism from the early 20th century to the breakup of the Soviet Union. So starting with Russia in the 12th century, with 12th century terrorism, the actions of the Narodная Volya, which means the people's will be the catalyst for Lenin to form the Social Democratic Labor Party. The Narodная Volya were also responsible for the assassination of General Mezentsev, and who happened to be the head of the OKHRNA, which is the Russian secret police. So by the turn of the century, the NV, we'll just call them for now, was basically wiped out, and the first 20 years of the 20th century were relatively quiet in Russia regarding terrorist activity. So here we have the NV. It's one of the earliest terrorist groups drawn from Russian elite class, wanted to overthrow the czars. Then you have Sofia Perovskaya, the daughter of a Russian general, who planted a bomb that killed the Tsar Alexander II. And then you have Perovskaya, who was arrested and executed with 5 other members of the group who were involved. So by the beginning of the century, the NV, Narodная Volya, we're just going to refer to them as the NV from this point forward, had little appeal to the working class, but the Social Revolutionary Party had a much broader appeal. As part of its platform, it created an autonomous group, the Bovaya Oranistya, or fighting organization. So we're just going to call them the BO from this point forward. There was considerable dissent amongst the party about the use of terror tactics by this group. So the revolution in 1917 saw the Bolsheviks under Lenin come to power, and the use of the BO was no longer necessary. It did, however, give way to a more sinister group. Throughout these chapters, there's been a lot of mention of the Leninist ideologies, especially when we covered some of the Western European groups, as well as some of the earlier radical Islamic groups, fostering that Leninist ideology. So here we finally meet Lenin, a Russian communist revolutionary. He's a politician and political theorist. Lenin also served as head of the government of the Russian Republic from 1917 to 1918, and of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic from 1918 to 1924, and of the Soviet Union from 1922 to 1924. Okay, just going to go over that once because you won't be asked that again, but just wanted to give you a little bit of a background on Lenin. Under his administration, Russia and then a wider Soviet Union became a one-party communist state governed by the Russian Communist Party. Primarily, he fostered a Marxist ideology, however, imposed his own theories, which manifested into Leninism. So, Russian state terror, the Bolsheviks, an extreme left-wing radical group, commenced a period of terror and repression against all groups that voiced opposition. Hundreds of artists and intellectuals were arrested who were simply amazed at the attitude of the Bolsheviks and had expected a society based on freedoms in the wake of the overthrow of the Tsarist government. The Bolsheviks dealt with nationalists, social revolutionaries, as well as members of the intellectual levels of society in the harshest manners. And even the church in Russia also became a target of communist terror and oppression. So the Chechnya was formed in 1917 with the intention that it would be disbanded after the Bolsheviks under Lenin had consolidated power. The first chief of this secret police force was Felix Dzerzhinsky, who had the power under the Bolsheviks to investigate all or any counter-revolutionary crimes. So Joseph, this is a good name, Vissarionovich Dzyugashi, and we're going to know that we know this guy is Stalin, essentially. So we'll call him Stalin. It's a lot easier. And that's the name he later took, meaning steel. He ruled the Soviet Union with an iron fist from the time of Lenin's death from 1929 to 1953 when he died. Under his regime, any dissent was viewed as a repudiation of the proletarian and a violation of the Marxist-Lenin ideology. Okay, so you, if you were a dissenter, you were either with him or against him. Let's put it that way. Yeah, if you were a dissenter, you were essentially dealt with in a very harsh manner. So, like I said, he's the absolute ruler of the Soviet Union, 1929 to 1953, a dedicated Marxist and first editor of the Pravda. He demanded blind obedience to his will, and his opponents were summarily dealt with, sent to gulags or shot. So now, throughout history, there have been many dictators who have purged their respective societies of all oppositions, both from within and outside their own political structures. The murder of a senior Politburo member on December 1st, 1934, was to set in motion a chain of events that resulted in the Great Terror, or also known as the Great Purge. Okay, so the senior Politburo member may not have been a true politician threat or a true political threat to Stalin. Nonetheless, Stalin saw his opposition as a threat in general. Okay, if you, like I said earlier, you were either with him or against him. The Great Terror ensued from 1934 to 1938. So it essentially encompassed deportations of dissenters, or people who were viewed as dissenters. So these deportations took place during and after World War II with the excuse that these deportees were collaborators with the Germans occupying forces, when in reality Stalin was diluting the pool of possible political opposition or threats. Okay, consequently, more than 1 million, primarily Muslims from the northern Bulgarians, Greeks, and Armenians from the Black Sea were all deported. So this the destination for the deportees, and you're going to want to remember this, was Uzbekistan, Siberia, and Kazakhstan. So here we have the timeline for the Great Terror. So you have the murder of the Politburo member Sergei Kirov in Leningrad. Stalin's purge begins. Millions of Russians sent to forced labor camps, and show trials and summary executions. The fear of Stalin's total domination of Russia. And then we covered the resettlement of over 1 million Muslims. So Tatars, Chechens, Meskhetians, Kalmyks from the Caucasus region. And they were deported to Uzbekistan, Siberia, and Kazakhstan. So the Soviet Union during the Cold War years was adept at not only training but sponsoring terror throughout the West as a means to destabilize its enemies. So you have the Patrice Lumumba University, also known as the Killer College, that was established in Moscow in 1961. Educational contribution to third world countries in Africa, and it provided training for terrorism. And the Venezuelan Communist Party, one of its famous alumni, Carlos the Jackal, the Venezuelan Communist Party sponsored Carlos the Jackal to attend the Lumumba University. So this epitomizes what I've said throughout the course, at the collaboration you'll see. So we have Carlos the Jackal, who has absolutely collaborated with Lebanese, and you know, you think about Venezuela, the relationship that we have with them today, it's not such a good one. And you think about them, their sponsorship, and how a Russian college now comes into play. So you have a three-way collaboration here. So moving on to our second learning objective, that's to understand how Russia, as a result of the Chechen crisis, has been subjected to terrorism from Islamists in the Caucasus region. So the Caucasus region, Chechnya, the Russian army has managed to fight two separate wars in Chechnya, and the last ending in 2000. Chechen bombs continued in Moscow. The Pushkin Square bombing on August 8, 2000 was detonated at the height of the evening rush hour. Injuries more than 90 and killing 12. Also, suicide attacks continued in 2004 with the simultaneous downing of two Russian passenger aircraft and train station attacks in Moscow. Chechnya suffers from a ferocious economic embargo from Russia, which has caused most of its infrastructure to either be destroyed or decay. Thus, Chechnya is barely functioning. So again, you have the May 9, 2004, Akhmad Kadyrov, Kremlin-backed president of Chechnya, killed in a bombing attack. The appointment in 2000 as head of Chechnya's civil administration. And he was entrusted to organize the 2003 referendum that would approve a constitution cementing its status as being inseparable from Russia. So we had the Caucasus Emirate group. This group has called for jihad, but is not seen as part of the global jihadist movement. The group is likely small, and a revival of the Redivius Selikin Martyrs Brigade that was originally formed by Shamil Samolikovic Basiev That is Shamil Salmanovich Vassiliev. And he was the right-hand man of the former Chechen president Dudiev, who was elected following the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. Now, Vassiliev was to Russians what Osama bin Laden was to the Americans. Vassiliev was killed by Russian FSB, a state security organization primarily used for intelligence, counterintelligence, and anti-terrorism in 2006. The Caucasus Emirate group is a follow-on group that originally organized the Vassiliev. Chechen Islamists called for jihad against Russia. Now, you think earlier, a couple slides back, we were discussing about the deportations, and also you had accompanied with some globalization. Russia had its own problems, encompassing bombing, suicide attacks, and assassinations as reprisals for attacking Chechnya. And it's believed responsible for the 2010 Moscow metro bombing and 2011 Domodedovo apartment attack. Carries out attacks in Ingushetia, as well as Chechnya and Russia. So these are essentially attacks against Russian interests. You have the Akhmad Kadyrov, which we covered just a minute ago. That's the Kremlin-backed president of Chechnya, killed in a bomb attack in 2004. Kadyrov planned to cement Chechnya as an inseparable part of Russia. And then you had the Beslan school siege, where 300 dead school children, which resulted in Russian special police storming and killing the assailants. And that is, you can actually find, I think I have a YouTube on the Blackboard. You're definitely going to want to watch that. It's very powerful, what happened. And it definitely illustrated that Russia did have a problem. Did have a problem that corresponds with its Muslim enemies in Chechnya. Then you have the Moscow theater siege. So, the Russian Criminal Code, terrorism is defined. The amendments and changes to Russian legislation seems to be clearly aimed at Islamists from Chechen regions. It corresponds with their threat. The Russian Criminal Code, an action endangering the lives of people, causing sizable property damage, or entailing other socially dangerous consequences for the purpose of violating public security, frightening the population, or exerting influence on decision making. The federal law on counteracting terrorism 2006 targets ideologies as well as practices by including them in the definition of terrorism and terrorist activity. So this also defines terrorism not only as the practices of influencing the decisions of government, local, self-government, or international organizations by terrorizing or through the forms of illegal violent action, but also any ideology of violence. So essentially, the initial Russian Criminal Code defines terrorism, any action endangering the lives of people. We just kind of went over that. Counteracting Terrorism Act of 2009, and that targeted ideologies as well as practices. And then you had jury trials banned for terrorist offenses. and that is proved by fences there. One funny thing about the Pearson site is some of the spelling. So it's approved by a Russian president, and terrorism definition being updated includes any ideology of violence, which correspond with the more contemporary threats Russia was facing. So moving on to our third learning objective, and that's to describe how the Balkan region became an area for ethnic cleansing. So Yugoslavia and communism. Josip Broz, referenced in the textbook as Tito, was a Yugoslav communist revolutionary and statesman who served in many capacities from 1943 until almost his death in 1980. Now, during World War II, he was the leader of the partisans known as the most effective resistance movement in occupied Europe. Now, while his presidency has been criticized as an authoritarian, sorry about that, and concerns about his political opponents have been raised. Some historians considered him a kind and compassionate dictator, and he was a popular public figure. He was viewed as a unifying symbol. His internal policies maintained the peaceful coexistence of the nations of the Yugoslav Federation. So Tito developed the second Yugoslavia, a socialist federation, from 1942 until 1992. Now, despite being one of the founders of the Cominform, soon he became the first Cominform member to defy Soviet domination, and the only one to manage to leave Cominform and begin its own socialist program. Tito was a backer of the independent roads to socialism. Now, when Tito died in 1980, the nationalist feelings among the republics was rekindled. So until Tito's death, nationalists in the six republics had kept their own aspirations in check. Muslims, Croats, and Serbs had lived side by side in peaceful coexistence. The communist state of Yugoslavia encompassed six separate republics, mainly founded on their ethnic or religious background. The area in question has been populated for at least 100,000 years. Now, differing groups of Slavs formed their own enclaves and independent states. Now, Serbians founded Serbia, and Croats founded Croatia. However, from the 1400 onward, the southern Slavs were ruled by foreign powers. So the first Slavs moved to the area in and around the 5th century, migrating from regions of southern Poland and the Russian republics. It's a Balkanized version of Northern Ireland. Slobodan Milosevic came to power in 1989 and played a dominant role in the conflict in both Bosnia and Croatia, provided military and financial support to the Serb nationalist campaigns. So he supported proposals from the international community for a brokered peace plan in 1994. However, it was not well enough received by the Bosnian Serb leadership. So this failure prompted Milosevic to close the border between the two republics. So in 1995, he signed the Dayton Peace Accord with Bosnian President Izzetbegovic. I tell you what, these Slavic names, they're hard. And Croatian President Tuđman. So Kosovo, the Kosovo Liberation Army, the KLA, was an ethnic Albanian paramilitary organization that sought the separation of Kosovo from the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, FRY, known as, and Serbia during the 1990s and the eventual creation of the Greater Albania. Its campaign against the Yugoslav security forces, police, government offices, and ethnic Serb villages triggered a major crackdown by the Yugoslav military and Serb paramilitaries within Kosovo, known as the Kosovo War of 1998-1999. The KLA was supported by Albanian and foreign volunteers and formed and attacked the elements of the Serbian police. So, we talked a little bit about Slobodan Milosevic. What comes to mind right away is crimes against humanity, and we're going to cover the definition. You're going to need to know the definition. So the UN defines crimes against humanity as any crime committed in armed conflict, whether international or internal in character, and directed against a civil population. So it encompasses acts such as murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, imprisonment, torture, and rape. So Milosevic was arrested and taken into the Hague in Netherlands to account for the murder of hundreds of ethnic Albanians, and he was charged with crimes against humanity. He later died while in custody in The Hague. So, and now we're moved on to our fourth learning objective, and that's to appreciate the difficulty in defining terrorism relative to the events in Balkans and Chechnya. So, Russia, we have comparisons we'd like to make here. If we contrast what has taken place in Russia and the former republics, we see a movement by Islamic fighters coming from Chechnya in response to the aggressive stance of the Russian military. So the first episodes would be defined as conventional warfare by Russia, and the U.S. declared its support for Russia by declaring that the Chechen issue was of an international nature and therefore a threat to the security of the U.S. Terrorism, therefore, is how the Russian authorities can address Chechnya, rightly or wrongly. So we'll make more comparisons. The former Yugoslavia. No doubt history will show Milosevic as a terrorist and a tyrant, but he was being tried for crimes against humanity for authoring the FRY forces at his disposal to kill unarmed civilians, overtaking towns and villages, and publicly executing civilians. The actions of FRY troops and Serbian police would put fear and terror into the minds of the ethnic group being targeted, but is cleansing, therefore, considered terrorism. Okay, that closes out the lecture on the readings. Now we're going to go through a chapter review. Okay, so in review, make sure you know that the BO, the Bovea Anesthesia, is the name of the terror sub-organization within the Russian Social Revolutionary Party and given autonomy under the party and also called the Fighting Organization. Also know that the gulags is the name given to the forced labor camps set up by the Soviet internal police for dissenters and political politicians. The KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army, is the name given to the Kosovar Albanian group that sought to break away from the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia in the 1990s. The Bolsheviks is the name given to the extreme left-wing radicals who favored revolution in Russia. Mehmet Ali Agha, who originated from Turkey, attempted to assassinate Pope John Paul II in St. Peter's Square in Rome. And the seeds of Russian terrorism were sown in the main part due to appalling conditions. The literal translation of the term Narodnaya Volya is the people's will. Mikhail Bakunin was the Russian orator that traveled widely through Europe promoting his revolutionary ideals. And Karl Marx believed capitalism had to be purged from Russian society. Lenin dissolved the Russian Constituent Assembly in 1918 when it failed to recognize the Bolshevik government. Continuing our review. The church is the Russian institution that became a target for communist terror and oppression. During the Cold War, the United States and NATO allies viewed the Soviet Union as the prime exporter and sponsor of modern-day terrorism. Joseph Stalin became the absolute ruler of the Soviet Union following the death of Lenin. Chechnya is the name given to the original Russian secret police formed in 1970. Sergei Kirov was the leader of the Communist Party in the Soviet city of Leningrad. Stalin ordered the forced resettlement of over 1 million ethnic Tatars, Chechens, Meskhetians, and Kalmyks, as well as Bulgarians, Greeks, and Armenians from the Black Sea coast. They were forcibly deported to Uzbekistan, Siberia, and Kazakhstan. Patrice Lumumba University is the official name for the university, nicknamed Killer College. And the Venezuelan Communist Party sponsored Carlos the Jackal's attendance at the Killer College. After leaving the Soviet Union in 1970, Carlos the Jackal relocated to Beirut, Lebanon. In support of the U.S. war on terror, Russian President Vladimir Putin took this as a tactic approval to attack Chechnya. So in summary, we had traced the history of Russian terrorism from the early 20th century to the breakup of the Soviet Union. We now understand how Russia, as a result of the Chechen crisis, has been subjected to terrorism from Islamists in the Caucasus region. And we have described how the Balkan region became an area for ethnic cleansing. And we now have appreciation on the difficulty in defining terrorism relative to the events in the Balkans and Chechnya. That concludes the Chapter 7 lecture. Make sure you check Blackboard for the expectations and deliverables associated with this chapter. Thank you for your participation. Stay tuned for Chapter 8.